data from lots of different studies. In this case, they had 7 different studies from around the world. They pooled all the data and looked at the dose response curve of what happens to a child IQ versus a blood lead level. And what we can see overall is what you expect. With a higher blood lead level, the IQ goes down. But what's really striking about this is that changes at the lower range of exposure are the most dramatic. Right? So if you look at the graph, a change between a blood lead level of 1 and 2, how you have a greater decrease of IQ than you would with a change in blood level from 30 to 31. Right? So in that sense, this is just more evidence that we have regulatory limits for lead, but really the only safe amount of lead is no lead. Okay, and so this is also really fascinating work done by Richard Nevin and colleagues. And this is, these are overlapping graphs. And what he did was take a timeline view of trends in the US versus trends in the use of lead in gasoline. So the blue lines in this graph are the use of lead in gasoline over the years. And you can see that in the US, we had peak lead in gasoline use around the 1960s and 1970s. And what he found was, by making these graphs, that a lot of trends in other traits mimic this if you add in a time delay. Right? So that's what this graph is showing you. The gasoline, lead, and violent crime. So you see the chart in blue is the lead. The chart in brown is violent crimes per person that happen roughly 15 to 20 years after that lead exposure. Right? So what you're seeing is we have trends in lead exposure that are followed by trends in issues that we know are related to lead exposure. Lead exposure is clearly associated with poor impulse control, neurological development, things that could easily lead to violent crime. Right? And we have a very close match of the trends in the population being exposed to lead with impacts on the society. And the same thing with the graph on the right with lead and gas versus teen pregnancies. All right, so myself and several other researchers are now posing the question of the population that was alive in the 1960s and 1970s is now starting to get older. Are we about to see another similar trend, but with neurodegenerative disease instead of teen pregnancy? We have limited evidence to suggest this might be underway. There's a lot of studies that show that exposure to lead can result in some of the precursors that are hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. So we know that we suspect that lead has a direct link to causing Alzheimer's. We know that lead is related to cognitive decline in later years. What we don't know is, should we be on the lookout for another graph that looks like this? And what we also don't know is what happens in a situation where you have exposure to lead, but life isn't just like that. We don't have one person exposed to only lead. You have people who are exposed to lead and mercury and PCBs and PPDs and PFAS and microbes. And the challenge is right now, most regulatory limits don't take that into account. They look at chemicals one at a time. So they say, we're looking at lead and only lead. Based on that, we'll give you a regulatory value. But if you have exposure to, say, lead and mercury, or lead and manganese, how does that work? What we think, what a lot of researchers suspect, is that there are synergistic effects between multiple chemicals, that if you're exposed to more than one, the effect is going to be greater than the sum of the parts. We're starting to gather evidence to show this, but it's not enough yet to have changed the regulatory limits. But if there's a lot of research in this area, and the group I work with is starting to do this research too, which is important because if we can find this, we can justify that the current limits we have, I suspect they're not strong enough in terms of protecting us from harm. That even if we're exposed at levels that the EPA or other federal agencies have determined is safe, there are still measurable impacts on our health. Okay, and to summarize, I do teach a lot of classes, so I like to have main points at the end of my lecture for people who might have slept through the rest of it. Lead is toxic. We've known that lead is a neurotoxicant for a very long time. However, a good news about lead is that exposure to lead has been reduced a lot in the past decades. At the same time, after our exposure was reduced, we have more and more evidence that even those lower exposures are still very harmful. And we're still learning about the full impacts of lead exposure on health in terms of lifetime effects and in terms of effects taken in context with the complex situation of pollutants and other factors in our environment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Wells. I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Beth Gingrich. And again, if you've got question cards, please, we've got a very helpful volunteer in the back walking around and collecting them.
I need both hands. Is this on? Okay. I need both hands to gesticulate here. Okay, hello. Still, good morning. I'm Elizabeth Gingrich. There's an E in that Gingrich to distinguish me from Newt in other ways too. But I teach international trade and business law at our College of Business here on campus. I'm also the editor-in-chief of an international journal, the Journal of Values-Based Leadership, which is actually downloaded every day on 6 continents. And I'm noticing as the articles come in almost on a daily basis that the majority of them are focusing now on leadership in fighting climate change. And what I do to supplement those articles, I do travel different parts of the world and obtain interviews from world leaders. And so this past summer it was the Iceland government and the government of Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. As to what they're doing. So I will just, I have a few pictures that will come that have been integrated into this presentation. So let's start. Let's hope this works. All right, is there a trick to this? Okay. We got several arrows here. Which one? Okay, very good. All right. There you go. Took this picture actually last summer in East Chicago. In terms of what we're facing right now, 2005, the whole world, in terms of their energy needs, and that includes electricity and heat, does not include transport necessarily, but you're looking at 86% using fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, coal. And these are the culprits behind climate change that emit the greenhouse gases. You're looking at methane and nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, CO2. So what's been the result of this? 2 years ago, we had Hurricane Harvey that devastated the city of Houston, a coastal town. You're looking at California. Wildfires beginning usually in June and extending throughout January have become the norm. If you've ever traveled through California after one of these wildfires is put out, it's lunar apocalypse. It's jaw-dropping. My son-in-law is a California firefighter, and it's just unnerving to see this happening, especially in this country. Of course, Katrina, 2005, led us all into this extreme weather abyss. Over 1,100 people lost their lives, and a good part of that city was displaced, and most of those folks have not returned. And this is becoming a common sight on the news, on the Weather Channel, as to what's approaching, an F3, an F4, an F5, hurricanes approaching the coast somewhere in the United States. Now, renewable energy. You've heard about the transition to renewable energy. Look at the basic options that we have here. Solar photovoltaic, solar PV. The solar panels that you see, my house is 4 blocks up. I've got my garage covered in solar panels. There's solar thermal. If you've ever been to Las Vegas, go a little bit out of the city and you're going to see one of the largest in the world, largest solar thermal farms there is, co-owned by Google. And these are not solar panels, they're mirrors. And they follow the trajectory of the sun and they beam again those rays onto a central tower of basically water. Wind, biofuels, MSU, Michigan State University, has one of the largest biodigesters on campus in this country. You're looking at more and more biofuels being used for air fuel. United uses them, especially every flight out of LAX now has a proportionate amount of biofuels in the United mix. Wind, go down 65, south on 65. You can't but notice the Fowler Wind Farm. That's the Benton County and the Fowler Wind Farm. The majority of that interest is owned by BP. Most of the energy that's produced, however, goes to the states of Virginia and Iowa. Not to Hoosiers, not to members of our state here. But you're looking at the 8th largest onshore wind farm in the world here in Indiana. Geothermal. Also, my house is geothermal and solar. I don't have a gas line to my house anymore. That's done. And so geothermal taps into the natural temperatures below the earth. I've got 6 wells. You can't see them. They go down about 150 to 200 feet where it's always 53, 54 degrees. And then you bring up your heat accordingly. Now we get to hydro, the often overlooked power source, and it's the #1 renewable energy. It is the #1. Now you've got 4 different types. You've got stored, which is what I'm going to be emphasizing, and that is basically the system of reservoirs and dams. You've got running, just basically tapping the flow of a gushing river without putting a dam in it, pumped. States like New York and Pennsylvania have been using this more and more. They pump water up to a higher elevated lake. And that pumping is done at night when electrical needs are low. And during the day, they allow that water to come back down to produce the energy at high rate needs. And then kinetic, you're basically tapping into the natural flow of water through waves and through tides. Okay. I'm not going to make you memorize this, but in terms of measuring electricity, you got to know a few terms. You're all familiar with the watt, right? A 40-watt bulb, a 60-watt bulb, correct? That's a watt. And then we graduate upwards to a kilowatt, to a megawatt, to a gigawatt, and finally to a terawatt. There are other categories, and I'm not going to go into those. But if you look at the leading countries in terms of using hydroelectric power and the highest generating capacity, China, Brazil, Canada, Norway, the United States, the Russian Federation, and India are currently the leaders. You look at global additions to hydro power capacity in 2017, estimated 19 gigawatts. For the last straight years, you've had basically a steady progression upwards. However, 2017 going into 2018, we're looking at somewhat of a leveling off. Now, once again, I just want to introduce you to some basic terms of how dams and reservoirs work. You're looking at the highest point of a reservoir of a dam is called the head. Then you've got the vertical, it's called a drop. And then you've got the semi-horizontal flow. It is that force that basically turns the blades of a turbine that feeds into a generator that produces electricity. In the United States, when did it start? First introduced in the late 1800s. If you're looking at the Depression era, the early 1930s, you're looking at the construction of two major dams, the two largest dams in the United States. First one, Hoover Dam, straddling the borders of Nevada and Arizona and tapping into the Colorado River. You do know what the reservoir behind it is called. That's Lake Mead. Very good. Grand Coulee. Has anybody ever been there? State of Washington. This is actually the largest generating capacity of our dams in the United States. This taps into the Columbia River, and actually the reservoir that was created behind the dam is called the Roosevelt Lake, the FDR Lake. He was the one that came and basically christened it in. Just to give you some graphs where we are with hydroelectricity in the United States as a renewable, it has been the fastest growing energy source in the United States, increasing 67% from 2000 to 2016. Renewables, all of those sources together constituted 26.5% of net U.S. electrical generation in 2017, with the bulk coming from hydropower. Then I want to emphasize what I just mentioned. There's been a slowdown in hydro development after 2017. Another graph to take a look at here. This actually goes from 1950 to 2017. This shows that we've had this progression upwards. We've had a few dips over the years. And then if you look at the percentage of hydro in terms of all of the sources of electrical generation, you're going downwards. All right, so again, we're dealing with, we're topping off here with hydro. And the question is why? Why are we doing that? I've shaded in those countries in blue that again are the highest generating in terms of hydroelectrical power. You see Russia, you see Norway, India, China, even Japan is up there. United States, Canada, and of course Brazil. Now I'm going to take little snippets around the world here. If you look at the EU, the European Union, at least presently comprised of 28 nations, there's been a goal of getting to renewables, more than 20% of the total power generated, getting to renewables by 2020, 20%. 11 nation states have already reached that goal. You look at Norway, 99% of their energy, their electricity actually generated comes from hydropower. If you look at Iceland, Iceland 70%. You add in geothermal for heat, 100% of heat and electricity in Iceland is generated from renewables. All right, China. China houses the world's largest dam and reservoir systems. It's called the Three Gorges, not gorgeous, Gorges Dam. And it supplies 70 to 80 million households, producing 22.5 gigawatts of electricity. Canada, you've got facilities on both coasts. When I interviewed the Minister of the Environment, you're looking at BC. British Columbia is 100% clean in terms of electrical generation. 97.7% is hydro. The rest is a mixture of wind, solar, and geothermal. Canada, on the opposite side, on the east side in Newfoundland and Labrador, they're currently building, they're not done yet, the Muskrat Falls Reservoir and Dam Project. It's currently being stagnated because there's ongoing litigation. The plaintiffs in most of these cases are Indigenous peoples, are First Nations, who are saying that what you're doing, you're poisoning our fish, you're altering our culture, you're destroying basically our ceremonies, and we don't like it. So again, there are things that you have to take into account as we proceed on with renewables. I used to live in southern Brazil. If you've ever been down that way, you've got one of the seven wonders of the world. You've got the Iguazu Falls on the Paraná River. This straddles the border of Brazil and Argentina, and just up the river a little bit, you've got the Itaipu Dam, which rivals the Three Gorges dams in China as one of the world's biggest hydroelectric power plants. This particular dam provides Paraguay with all of its energy, provides Brazil with 1/4 of its energy needs. All right, now we're going to look at the negative. Of course, there's always a negative, all those pretty pictures. We started with the wagon wheel. Everybody's familiar with that. That goes centuries beyond in terms of just generating enough power to, again, grind the grain and provide at least a minimal light. And then we've escalated to medium facilities, dams and reservoirs. This is one taken in Portugal. And here's the granddaddy of them all. This is the one in China, the largest in the world. That's more than a factory. That's a nation in and of itself. I've had a number of Chinese students who indicate, too, that it was not pleasant living around this particular area when this was being built in terms of flooding the plains. Energy challenge. For the world to harness the power of moving water to produce clean, renewable energy without major harm being inflicted upon water quality, wildlife, and ecosystems. This is a perfect example. This is a photo I took a few months ago in Iceland. This is the Gullfoss Falls. So many business folks and even government officials have wanted to construct a hydro facility right here. The residents for years have blocked these attempts, wanted to keep this pristine and open to basically visitor traffic. And as you can see, there are a number of visitors. You just strut out right there. It's awe-inspiring to see this. So let's look at the advantages of hydro-powered electricity. Lessens dependence on fossil fuels and provides drinking water. If you've ever been to San Francisco, did you know that most of that city is, its water and its electrical needs are provided by a hydroelectric facility in Yosemite Park? It's the Hetchy Hetch Reservoir in Yosemite Park. And you're thinking that's quite a distance away. It's actually not that. It depends on the route you go. But it does not take additional energy to get from Yosemite Park to get that water power into San Francisco because it's all gravity based. It is all gravity based. And they're actually expanding these facilities. It doesn't pollute the air or water. At least the provision of hydroelectric power does not pollute. The facilities, the construction of the facilities and what they do to organic matter, that's a different story. And of course, it provides irrigation to allow for agriculture, for farming in various areas that never before could have this option. And recreational opportunities, swimming and boating and fishing. Now, the negatives. If you have been to Hoover Dam recently, this photo was taken just a couple months ago in February. You see that white line, right? That indicates the drop of the elevation of water in Lake Mead. That's quite a drop, okay? So here's some statistics from February. It's currently at about 1,086 feet above sea level at 1,050 feet. The lake can no longer generate hydroelectricity, and at 895 feet, it cannot provide water for consumption. Arizona is under a water crisis. You're going to hear more about this. South Africa had it this time last year, running out of water. So we're seeing this right now. Disadvantages, it does compromise water quality. It adds methylmercury to the water. It alters water temperatures. So here's what happens. When you construct that new man-made lake, that reservoir, and you flood it basically because you need that standing water, that stored water, you're going to cover plants. You're going to cover trees. And these are natural. They basically, well, they store CO2. So when they're covered with water, they're going to decompose, but they're going to decompose without the aid of oxygen in an anaerobic situation. It's like putting your banana peel in a plastic bag thinking, well, I'm going to throw this out and it's all going to be broken down naturally. It's biodegradable until you put it in the plastic bag. And again, you seal it from oxygen. Same thing with our landfill waste. It goes in, it's covered up. If you've driven by any landfills, do you see the flames coming out of certain pipes? What is that doing? Why do we see flames? It's burning off methane because, again, in anaerobic situations, the decomposition of bioorganic material produces methane. And of those three greenhouse gases, methane is the most toxic. And here, once again, from China, this is what happens when you start building a big reservoir and you don't really consider the local community's needs. often flood the plains, often flood, again, basins. Compromises infrastructure. This was taken from Northern California at the Oroville Dam. Again, think about the pressure a reservoir puts on the back of a dam wall of a dam. I'm going to have to put it that way, of a dam wall. You have this compromise, and you have this offshoot, even going over the emergency spillways. This still has not been corrected fully. All right, the future. There's 2 more slides here. Future, again, closed any compromised or unused dams. There are 84,000 currently in the United States. It compromises 17% of all the rivers in the U.S. Improve the efficiency of existing turbines and generators. Capture the methane before it's off gas from the water surface. Again, methane comes up from that underwater decomposition. It becomes little bubbles on top of the water, and as the water flows, those bubbles break. Methane goes into the air. All right, pursue micro hydro projects here. It's notable that 1 milliwatt or megawatt of electricity is used by about 750 homes at any given moment. Small facilities are typically less than 30 megawatt capacity. You're seeing this all over the states of Oregon and Washington going on right now. These micro hydro projects. And lastly, electrify a current of underused dams by installing new generators. We just talked about lining landfills with either plastic or concrete. If you know anything about mixing concrete, it's got a high carbon footprint. And so, of course, using plastic, we all know about the dangers of that. Or aerate the water. Adopt better clearing practices or burying techniques. When you clear the basin to flood it for the reservoir or the standing water or the man-made lake, at least clear it fully, bury the plants way deep down so you don't have this methane generation. And lastly, life is about choices. Water is life. And so you have to look at energy needs. You have to look at what does it take for you to live in this world. I would say live simply so others can simply live. And so make those choices, but make those knowing that there are risks involved, there are benefits involved, and you've got to weigh both. Thank you.
Do you want to speak here? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I do realize and understand that I'm between you and lunch, so that I will move as quickly as possible. My name is Curtis Whitaker. I'm the pastor of Progressive Community Church and the CEO of Faith CDC. Faith stands for Families Anchored in Total Harmony. We're in Gary, Indiana, and a couple of things that water is life, and we believe that. We also believe that food is life. And one of the interesting points that Mark brought out that fascinated me is 3 of those 4 communities he highlighted were of people who look like me, African Americans. At least the 3 that I saw, the majority of the folks there were African Americans. And so we decided as a faith community that we could do something about what is impacting us as African Americans. I'm from Gary, about 85. Hey, Deb. See Deb in the back. She would know about 85, 90% of the folks there are African Americans. And so we, a lot of the things that you talk about, we're a post-industrial city. Facing a lot of decline in population, struggling to figure out what to do with sections of community a la Detroit. Just a lot financial issues going on in Gary. But in the backdrop of all that, we decided, God gave us a vision. This is our church, white church there. Right next to us used to be that greenhouse, no pun intended, and that red house used to be right next to where we were. God gave us a vision about 5 years ago He told us that there is going to be a famine in the land and that we need to know where our food comes from. Now, I'm a farmer. I went to Growing Power to learn how to do this, because 5 years ago, I knew nothing about farming. The closest I came to farming is my neighbor had a garden in her backyard. She was from down south. She moved up, and we like to play baseball. And so every now and then, our ball, we'd hit it, and it'd go in her garden. And so I would go over to her garden to fetch the ball, and she would say, "Get your you-know-what out of my garden." Closest I came to gardening growing up. But 5 years ago, because I'm a city guy, I grew up in the city, so I didn't know anything about gardening, farming. 5 years ago, God gave us a vision. So in between those two houses is where we started. We started with 3 raised beds, and we grew a lot of food. And the church said, "Let's grow some more." And I said, "Y'all sure y'all want to do this?" And they said yes. And so we partnered with the city of Gary, and the city of Gary knocked down that greenhouse. That allowed us to grow some more, and we grew this. First slide, where that greenhouse is. We had 8 12 by 12 raised beds, which is our next project. We grew a lot of food. We said this is going to be the Garden of Eden, peace garden. We got a lot of violence. Maybe the violence is associated with the lead. Now that I saw that slide, I'm like, maybe that's why we got a lot of violence in Chicago and in Gary and some of these other places. But that could be a cause of it. So I'm gonna hold on to that slide that I saw. But we said, you know what? Yes, there is violence, and instead of beating somebody up, come pull some weeds. And so that's what had us do this. This is where we did, and then somebody found out about what we were doing, and they came and wanted to know. Those are pumpkins growing there. They wanted to know how our growing was going. We grew a lot of food, and the church said, "Let's do it again." And I said, "You sure you want to do it again?" In the midst of that, I love renewable energy. And I believe that God has called us to be good stewards over the earth. And by good steward, don't mean dominate, as the word dominion, some folks say. I don't believe it means to dominate. It just means to be a good steward over what God has given us. Somebody said it means to serve and preserve, and I agree with that we ought to be serving and preserving our community. So in the midst of that, 3 years ago, we embarked on a solar panel mission on our church. We're the only church in Gary with solar panels on its roof. And I was intentional because of the fact that just like in this room, there are not a lot of African Americans who are in renewable energy. And so every renewable energy, I called about 8 to 10 of them, every last one of them, all across the state and outside of the state. My first question was, how much do they cost? My second question was, can the members of my church get engaged in learning about how to install solar panels? Because I live in the community we live, my church is in the downtown Emerson community of Gary. If you've been to the Railcats baseball stadium, that's downtown Emerson. Our church is right around the corner from there. And so that community's household income is $13,000 a year. Yeah, $13,000 a year. And so I said, hey, we have an opportunity here. Renewable energy is a growing field. Unfortunately, in the state of Indiana, they passed some policies that, in my opinion, have taken us backwards. But it's a growing field. And so each of the folks we reached out to said, "Pastor, no problem. We would love to train the folks in your community and in your church on how to install solar panels." I'm thankful to God that I have the guy in the middle photo here is a certified electrician. So I'm thankful to God that they allowed him to also participate. We have 30 solar panels on our roof. There we are on the top of the roof. Each of us who participated in the installation, on average, over the last 3 years, we saved over $100 a month. in our utility costs. Our bill has gone down. And for us, that is huge. The panels cost about $20,000 total installation. We got a grant for $10,000. We came out of pocket for the rest. It takes us about now 5 years is our payback. You'd know this. Anybody else with solar, you always try to figure out, or any type of renewable energy source, what's your payback period. So we're a sustainable community. I told you we went down to growing power. Anybody remember has heard of Mr. Will Allen? We went down to Milwaukee, and Mr. Will Allen, who's known as the father of urban ag in America, he gave us some training on how to grow food, because for the most part, none of us knew what we were doing. We just put seeds in the ground, and we are good prayers, so we prayed over them. Anybody good prayers in here? Yeah, I couldn't pass some exams, and I didn't do what I was supposed to do, and sometimes I did do what I was supposed to do, and the Bible said he'll bring it back to your remembrance. And I said, Lord, I looked at it yesterday. Bring it back to my remembrance. Yeah, but we went, and Mr. Will Allen, I went down there we wanted one hoop house. I got down there, I shared our vision with Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen said there have been at least 30 people from Gary who've come and talked to me, wanted me to come to Gary, and I haven't been, but I hear your passion and I hear your spirit, and I'm going to come up there and help you. And so he came to Gary, and this is us. You saw at the first slide, we had a green house and a red house. The city demolished both of those houses. For us, after those houses got demolished, I looked at that and I said, you know what? We're not only, because we're in the midst of a food dump. Anybody ever heard of a food dump? Okay, you probably heard of a food desert. Yeah, I call them dumps. Why I call it dump and not a desert? Because in a desert, very few things grow. But in a dump, you can go get food anytime you want to. You'd be fighting against the rats and the birds and all the rest of those folks, but animals. But you probably don't want to eat food out of a dump. But in Gary, we have grocery stores that sell us food like as if it comes from a dump. And we have limited options and choices as to what we do. And so this is a way for us